Good morning, everybody. My name's Julie Swan. I'm Director of Education and Training at the SRA, and I'd like to welcome you to this session on continuing competence, when we're going to address the risks and consider how to take the opportunities. Now, the way this is going to work is that we're going to see a recording of the same session that we did at the Compliance Officers Conference in Birmingham a couple of weeks ago. We're then going to invite you to submit your questions, which the small panel that's with me this morning can take. So just who's with me? I've got Claire Collins. Morning, Claire. Claire's a business consultant with Powering Up. And you'll see more of Claire in the video as she was with us at the event in Birmingham. And then we've got Richard Williams, who's a colleague of mine, a policy manager at the SRA. Quick wave from Richard. Thank you, Richard. And so Claire, Richard and myself will be taking your questions once we've seen the video. We do want this to be an interactive session. It's not going to be much of a question and answer session if you don't post your questions, so please take the opportunity to do so. It's very simple. You just need to click on the link below this broadcast and submit your question to us. You can do so anonymously if you prefer, although it's always nice to have a name, so please feel free to add your name too. So get your questions coming in to us, please. But we'll now look at the video and we'll be back with you in about 40 minutes.
It was at this conference, I think in 2015, or it might have been 2016, that we announced our intention to remove the requirement on all solicitors to complete 16 hours of learning and development per year. And instead, we were put in place our approach to continuing competence. Now, a lot has changed in regulation in the world in general since then, but what hasn't changed, and I think you would have picked up this from Anna and Paul this morning, is the importance we place on solicitors maintaining their competence throughout their careers. And the way that they do that is by keeping their knowledge and skills up to date. The importance is also focused on firms and making sure that they've got the right systems, controls in place to make sure that their individuals that they employ are indeed competent. So I wanted to spend the next sort of 10 minutes doing two things. One, to just clarify what we expect from solicitors in terms of our continuing competence obligations, and then secondly, to pick out some of the challenges, themes and risks that we're seeing in practice, so you can go away and have a think about how you might want to address them if they are indeed present in your firm. Okay. So what do we mean by continuing competence? It really is, as Julie says, about solicitors maintaining their competence and continuing to meet the standards we set out in our statement of solicitor competence throughout their careers. And as I've said, the way that they do that is by keeping their knowledge and skills up to date. I've put on the screen there the sort of 5 core elements of what we expect in terms of keeping and solicitors meeting their continuing competence obligations. We don't prescribe exactly how solicitors should do it, but if you're following those 5 steps, you're more than likely to be meeting our continuing competence obligations. Now, I don't intend to go through each of those steps because I think some of those are pretty self-explanatory, and also there's an awful lot of resources and material on our website which you can go away and have a look at in your own time. But I really wanted to pull out two points, and these are the kind of common themes and challenges that we've got lots of questions come into us to the SRA, but also we know that they are particularly problematic for some solicitors and some firms. Now, the first is reflection. Reflection, I suppose, for kind of in terms of legal parlance, probably is still alien to a number of solicitors and firms. But what it means in practice is a solicitor thinking about the challenges and the quality of their practice. And reflection is really important because that process of asking questions about challenges and quality of practice, for example, how am I doing? Is there anything else that I need to do differently? Where can I improve? Helps identify any potential learning and development needs. So it's absolutely critical to maintaining competence. I think what we're often asked is, how often should I reflect? Is it a once a year, once a month? And again, we don't prescribe this, but I think our view is that reflection should be a regular and ongoing exercise. Now, a lot of you will have systems in place, PDRs, appraisals that give you an opportunity to do that. But I think our view is that this needs to, as I said, needs to be sort of an ongoing, organic process, and that's important because it helps you identify, or helps the solicitor identify, any emerging learning and development needs. So I think there's a couple of takeaways there for you to think about. The other issue or challenge that we often see is about recording. Now, it's not a regulatory requirement that solicitors or firms document reflection or document their learning and development. For example, we don't say we don't have a rule that says you need to keep a training record. But actually, I think based on the work that we've done recently, and I'll come on to that in a little while, what we're seeing is actually that we think now it's important that solicitors are keeping a training record. And it's important because I think two reasons really. One, from a purely regulatory perspective, it helps a solicitor and you and your firm demonstrate to us that you're taking these steps, you're putting them in practice, and you're meeting your obligations. So it's there as a piece of evidence for you. But also, I think it's just good business practice and it's good staff development practice. And I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more from our panellists about that. Now, you will probably all have training records or forms of some description, but if you haven't and you're thinking this is what you might need, we do have an awful lot of resources on our website. We have a learning and development template which captures these 5 steps that individuals can use. I mean, if you already use a particular form, it might be just worth cross-referencing to see if there's anything you might want to do in terms of making any particular improvements. So hopefully that sort of clarifies what we're after really in terms of those continuing competence obligations. I just want to talk about, I suppose, what we're seeing in practice at the moment. Now, in August, we published our first annual assessment of competence. Now, the purpose of that was for us as a regulator to obtain our assurances that solicitors and firms are meeting their regulatory requirement to keep their skills up to date, and as firms, they're making sure that their staff have competence. So it's really kind of lifting up the rock a little bit to see what's happening on the ground. But also, we thought it would be a really useful piece of work for you as firms to kind of understand what we're seeing, so you can kind of cross-reference, bench check, and think about whether anything that we're seeing presents a risk or a challenge in your organisation. I don't plan to go through the entire report. It is on our website, but I do encourage you to have a look at it and particularly to circulate it to learning and development colleagues in your organisation. But I do want to pick out a couple of issues that we are seeing, and again, this touches a little bit on what Anna and Paul were talking about this morning. We analysed 42,000 reports made to us by stakeholders, the public, other organisations during the period 2019 to 2023. So we had a lot of data and we crunched that data an awful lot. And what we found was that actually when you look at that data and those reports by practice area, we were getting more reports in relation to probate matters, residential conveyancing and immigration services. So if you're working or provide those services, it might be worth having a little think about cross-referencing, making sure that the staff that do those work are maintaining their competence, because that's where we're really seeing the kind of concentration of reports. In relation to the nature of those reports, just over half relate to ethics, professionalism, judgment, and that's section A of our statement of solicitor competence. In terms of looking at those reports in a little bit more detail, we did try and scratch under the surface and try and kind of understand what they related to in terms of section A of the solicitor competence. And I think what was clear is that we were seeing a lot of reports around kind of professional obligations and ethics. So it's important, and you'll know this, that all solicitors are fully aware of their professional obligations and risks associated with their practice area. Now, to do that and to maintain competence on this particular issue, a solicitor really needs to understand the relevant SRA principles and the SRA rules and apply them in practice. But importantly, it's also important that they understand and are aware of any warning notices or any practice-specific guidance we have issued as a regulator. So a couple of things for you perhaps to think about as COLPs there is, are you plugged into getting information from us about warning notices and guidance? If so, if not, how can you do that? You know, signing up to our SRA kind of monthly email is one way of doing that, but also to make sure that they're circulated to appropriate staff. So we also found that there was challenges with reflection and evidencing training. Now, that's not a surprise to us. I started off talking about reflection and clarifying what it meant, because I think it is still a slight issue for some solicitors. What we found was probably two things really, that based on the training records that were submitted to us from our training record reviews in criminal work, youth court work, for example, we found that it was really, really difficult for us to understand why individuals were undertaking their training. And that's because there was no evidence or no documentation that they'd thought about what it is that they need to do. So a lot of the records we saw were just lists of training, and some of the activity on that list at first glance was not related to the area of practice that individual's undertaking. So I think there's something there for people to think about in terms of, are you really capturing the thought that goes in from solicitors into why they're driving their learning and development and making sure that's in place. In terms of reflection, we found a couple of things. We found that people were really struggling to make time to reflect. Now, that's not a surprise to any of us or any of you. You know, solicitors are often time short individuals working particularly hard. But I think, as I said earlier, it is important to try and make time and space just to think about how things are going. Now, that doesn't have to be particularly structured. It can be just thinking about issues after a particular case, after a particular piece of work, but just creating a little bit of space to think, okay, where am I? How am I doing? We also found that actually senior individuals in some organisations felt that they did not need to meet our continuing competence obligations. I just wanted to be clear that actually our obligations apply to all solicitors, irrespective of where they may be in your organisation. So again, that's a message that you can take back to your organisation. And finally, in terms of what we found that actually across some firms, and again, all of this isn't about every single firm, this is just what we've seen from some of the work that we've carried out, is that there were ineffective supervision arrangements. Now, good, effective supervision is a regulatory requirement, and it's really important because it helps manage risk that individuals are not acting above their competence. But also it's integral to kind of the reflective process, because it helps individuals, by having a kind of a different view to their work, identify any potential learning and development issues. So again, you might want to think about your supervision arrangements in your organisation. And finally, on that point, we found that the impact of hybrid working was contributing to perhaps some ineffective supervision arrangements. We found that there was less structure because of hybrid working, and actually those kind of regular touch points, those regular check-ins weren't often there. So just looking forward now to what we're going to do over the next 12 months in terms of us as a regulator obtaining assurances that solicitors and firms are doing what we ask, so we can do our job as protecting the public. Anna talked a lot about data this morning, and I've already mentioned the number of reports that we analysed. We'll continue that. We will continue to really mine our data to help us try and identify competence issues and themes that are emerging out there, so we can understand them, we can understand their impact, and we can help you understand them as well. We're also going to be far more proactive in how we respond to competence reports. And there's a couple of examples of us doing that I thought I would get on your radar. The first is about us, where we receive a competence report that probably doesn't meet our threshold for enforcement action, being a little bit more proactive and contacting you as a firm and you as a CULP to say, we've received this report. Is there anything in it? Should we as a regulator be worried? If there is something in it, please can you confirm that you've done something about it? So from the end of this year, we'll be rolling out that particular process. We'll also carry out a number of proactive inspections, and they're slightly different from thematic reviews. A thematic review, I suppose, is more of a kind of a fact-finding exercise. Inspections are slightly more kind of forensic. We want to know exactly your systems and controls you have in place as a firm to maintain your competence. So there will be a thematic inspection taking place later this year with a sample of firms where we really want to understand what your controls are. And I think more importantly, whether those solicitors that you employ are actually following them. We'll continue to carry out our training record reviews. Now, we've done an awful lot of this work over the last 12 months with a heavy focus on kind of criminal advocacy, youth court, magistrates court, and higher court work. Given what our data's telling us, we're now going to shift our focus to look at immigration and asylum firms. So we'll be calling in a series of training records over the next month to 6 weeks for us to have a look at and to understand what types of training are taking place and whether they are relate to activity. And that, again, is about us understanding whether people are meeting our obligations and undertaking any learning and development. But it's not about us just kind of looking for problems. We also want to support solicitors and support firms to help meet our obligations. So we'll have in place a whole raft of resources to help solicitors understand our requirements in more detail. We'll be developing some resources on what reflection looks like in practice. So you've got some helpful tips for solicitors there. We'll also be looking at guidance around what we expect in terms of making our annual declaration. Now, just as a reminder, all solicitors have to make an annual declaration as part of renewing their practicing certificate that they have identified and addressed their learning and development needs. And I know many CULPs I've spoke to this morning do that on behalf of their solicitors. Now, we want to make sure that as a kind of mechanism is driving the right types of learning and development behaviours. So we'll be taking a look at whether it is working, how organisations and firms obtain their assurances that solicitors are doing the things that we're asking them to do. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a roadmap of where we are and where we're going to over the next 12 months. And as I said, there's an awful lot of resources about kind of reflection, identifying needs, those steps on our website. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those or share them with your learning and development colleagues. I'll be on the stand in the main hall a little bit later. So if you've got any kind of bespoke questions that you want answered outside of this session, I'm more than happy to help you. But I think that's it from me, Julie.
Thank you, Richard, and you'll also be taking questions now.
Indeed,
yes.
Join
the panel. So thank you so much. So let's open this out and bring in John and Claire and really learn from your insights and experiences, please. So Richard's spoken quite a lot about the compliance aspect of continuing competence, but let's look beyond compliance. How do you, when you're working with firms, including the most senior members of your firms, I noticed some nods of recognition when Richard said some think this isn't for them, but how do you sell the benefits of continuing competence, of maintaining knowledge and skills that perhaps goes beyond the compliance requirement?
Yeah, do you want me to jump in?
Please do, Claire.
So yeah, and engagement is a key factor here, isn't it? That compliance piece. And I think the phrase continuing competence, I think you should use that not just as a stick, but as a carrot. I think it's an opportunity. When you talk about continuing competence in your organisations, to share the benefits of doing this really well. So if you do this really well, you're more likely to retain your talented staff. They'll thrive, they'll develop. You'll be future-proofing your business, looking at things coming down the track like AI, ESG, all of those topics that your lawyers should be thinking about and being in the conversation and upskilled in. And I think for those reasons, it should be really high up on the agenda. And it's not about just putting a tick on your risk register to say, yes, we have checks and balances. It's about seeing it as an opportunity to have a conversation and to get people doing the right behaviours, because the right behaviours are the best thing for your business. They'll drive your business.
That's clear. John?
First of all, I'd like to say I'm delighted to be here for a day where I'm not chasing lawyers tidying up their training records at the end of the CPD year in head of the bulk renewals. So we do actually have a comprehensive system in place at Trowers. So we expect people, and it's via a learning management system that makes it a little bit easier. So we do expect people to plan, show the activities that they've done to address the particular need, a bit of reflection on how that need's been addressed and what they've learned from it. So that does help, but the principles are exactly the same, that we expect people to have a training record in whatever form it is for different organisations. So I think that does help. I mean, we stress actually this isn't about competence, it's about continuing excellence. So kind of what we're showing is actually people need to be the best they possibly can to meet their clients' needs, and also as well, obviously, to develop their own careers and knowledge. So we kind of say that, you know, you wouldn't expect your doctor, for example, not to be keeping up with key developments in their practice. It's the same for lawyers. Probably worth saying as well, whether I know lots of firms don't do this, but we did maintain our own minimum hours expectation when we discussed this many years ago. So people are still saying to me, have I got my 16 hours? And I'm saying, no, that's just an internal requirement that changed 8 years ago. But we have maintained our own requirements, because I think if you look at it, the breadth of the competency statement, it's looking at keeping up with SRA requirements, it's ethics, it's skills, it's your legal area of practice, it's associated legal areas of practice, it's keeping up with D&I, it's supervisory skills, it's communication skills. So I would be kind of shocked if that were less than 16 hours per year. So we have got a minimum target in, and actually just on the point about the more senior people, we point to the threshold standard in the competence statement, which talks about mastery of the area of practice at the more senior level at level 5. So it is completely sort of banging the drum, repeating the messages, but I think the key thing is actually to have structures in place for exciting ways of sharing knowledge, training within the organisation, and people responsible within the organisation beyond L&D for making that happen. So it's not straightforward. It's a complex thing. If you're dealing with individuals more than team structures, then it's, I suppose, encouraging those people as well to be taking active steps to keep on top of their learning and being able to demonstrate how that's happened. Probably just to say, actually, the SRA did come knocking a year or so ago to look at everything that we were doing, and I think we got the thumbs up. So kind of it can happen that people come, and the SRA will come from time to time just to see how you're doing on it.
And just to pick up on your point, John, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I was in my L&D role in an organisation, continuing competence was constantly kind of batted to the learning and development team as this is your thing, when actually things like reflection sit more broadly with HR. It even sits with business development teams and their client surveys. What feedback do we get? So I think that's a really important message to take back. It's not just a learning and development thing, it's actually much broader.
Yeah, and I think particularly the reflection piece is where does that come from? So I think a little bit is obviously within you. You know your own abilities, you know where you are on the knowledge curve. So we encourage people at the start of each CPD year effectively to say, right, what are my needs for the year? And they'll come up with a few core needs and try to address them during the course of the year. There'll be those particular points as well during the year where they'll have check-ins. So I think those appraisals, whether it's an annual appraisal or I think more ideally more regular check-ins where others will highlight what they perceive as learning needs. So it's a mixture of you as an individual, others reflecting back to you. And actually the interesting thing, Claire, you said about clients, well, that's kind of a braver thing to do, but getting feedback from your clients as well. They'll kind of know about your service. So we're starting to do more actually formal client care reviews. So I think typically the client care reviews will focus on the level of service, how they found the firm's performance, perhaps discuss further opportunities. But it could also be that real opportunity to say, how did I do? How did my team do? And of course, that can open you, and that can feel uncomfortable, I think, for lawyers sometimes, but actually better to have that knowledge out in the open than actually festering in a client's head. And of course, you can then use it for developmental purposes as well. So I think that reflection and getting ideas from clients as well as internally from yourself are kind of really, really important. And we kind of say, look, to our lawyers, you don't have to write War and Peace on your reflections. These are fairly simple, sharp reflections. And actually, it's building on what we do for trainees as well. So trainees have a training contract record where reflections are a core part of it. It would be extremely odd if that disappeared once you got up to the qualified lawyer level.
So how do you deal with the solicitor of the type that Richard referred to, who says, I'm too busy, I don't have time for this?
Well, I think you'll run out of time. It will seem onerous. It will be time intensive if you make it a once a year event. So I think that's the point there in terms of time. I think the key is to do little and often. So if you get into good habits of always recording the training that you do, and you include in maybe that diary record why you're doing it, how it benefited you, maybe colour code it, those kind of little and often habits are the thing that means it doesn't actually take much more time. It's just the rhythm of things that you do. But I think if you decide you're going to do it at one point towards the end of the year, and you're going to have to scroll back and have a look at everything you did and think about all the feedback that you had, if you do quarterly check-ins rather than an annual review, then it's onerous. And then it is time intensive. So I think get into good habits, and then you've mastered that time issue.
That's clear. I really like the idea of the rhythm of recording and reflecting. That's good. Yeah.
I'm going to use that phrase, the rhythm of recording.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, and I think with senior people as well, a lot of people are actually doing stuff that counts for CPD without realising it. So in fact, one of the great things that the changes did in 2015, 2015? I think it was 15. Anyway,
it was a long time ago.
A long time ago. Was it used to be very formal about the strict requirements for CPD. 25% had to be got there, 75% accredited providers. That all disappeared. So actually the things that people do to read up on the law are as equally valid as attending a formal training session. So, and conversations within the firm. So actually we encourage people, look, if you're sitting down having a great conversation with a partner, for example, and they're sharing their knowledge of a new change in law or a new change in market or client development, that's all CPD as well. So it can go from the very structured to the less formal. So capturing it can actually be just noting as well what you are doing to keep on top of your skills and knowledge. And what I do say to the senior people as well, actually sharing that knowledge, developing know-how sessions, sharing your expertise, that's driving your knowledge and skills as well. So in a sense, for the more senior people, it's about developing their own knowledge and skills, so the leadership skills, etc., but also passing it on to more junior people as well. And that can all be reflected in training records.
Thanks, John. Richard, did you want to come in?
I mean, I think the easy answer would be to the question of how do you make someone do something is obviously we will potentially come looking for evidence that they have done it. But other than that, I think just building on John's point that, we know from the work that we've done and speaking to lots of firms that solicitors do this anyway. It's part of being a professional. It's part of, upholding the kind of principles and rules that we put in place. So I think it's kind of reinforcing that they probably do this anyway. And also, I think Claire's point about kind of getting into the habits of just jotting it down. It doesn't kind of matter. It doesn't have to be War and Peace, but it needs to be, I think, documented to give us evidence, are quick, helpful tips that can help people understand that actually, you know, this doesn't have to be a massively over-engineered process. It can be relatively quick, simple and short.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I just actually reference other professions as well, which have to maintain large portfolios of work to actually show this is the, you know, this is a document I drafted to prove this competency. So if there is strong resistance, it's kind of it could be worse. Is my line, and that's absolutely true. So I think personally, this is the right balance that has been maintained between for busy lawyers, but also being able to evidence that they're doing what they should be doing to keep on top of their skills and knowledge. And at the end of it, we say we won't renew your practicing certificates unless you do that as well.
That's definitely the stick side. Yeah. Thanks, Richard. You mentioned the importance of supervision. Before I ask Claire and John how they see the role of the supervisor in securing continuing competence or continuing excellence, is there anything else you wanted to add on supervision?
Well, I think I explained when I was talking to the slides that actually, you know, the importance of effective and good supervision in managing risks to your firm, but also making sure that solicitors aren't acting above their competence. You know, and we see a lot of really good supervision, but as I said, we see pockets where it isn't as structured. I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing is hybrid working, and I touched on that. And I think, you know, you need to think through about whether or not, if you have a hybrid working structure, you've still got those checks and balances, those touch points in place for individuals to kind of replicate what would have happened in, I suppose, the world before COVID, a 5-day in the office working environment. So I think it's something for you to take away. We have issued some kind of guidance on what kind of hybrid working, what supervision in a hybrid working environment looks like, and there are some really helpful practical tips in there. So I'd encourage you to kind of find that on our website and have a look at if there's any of those that you might consider implementing.
Thanks, Richard. So the role of the supervisor.
I think I've got a couple of thoughts on this. So first of all, in learning and development, we talk a lot about the 70-20-10 rule. So only 10% of training or learning happens in a formal training environment. They, you know, estimate that 20% is informal, kind of peer coaching and those kind of team meetings, conversations. A whopping 70% is just learning on the job. And I think if you haven't got some kind of supervision in place, then that 70% of practice is less valuable because you're not thinking about it, reflecting on it. I think the role of a supervisor is to sometimes challenge your thinking, to share things with you that might be blind spots that you may have missed. There's always a different way of doing something that might have been better. And why not harness the power of a colleague? And I don't think a supervisor has to be a senior person, more senior to you. It can just be a colleague that you both say, let's be accountable, let's share with each other work and how we might have done it better and what have you seen coming down the track that might influence this. So I think put those things in place as best practice. Yeah, so that was it. That was my 2 points.
Yeah, and I think the whole hybrid working makes this even more important as well, because, you know, anyone working remotely needs to be properly supervised as much as anything to maintain the quality of the output. So I see a supervisor partly, well, a great deal, just making sure the quality of the final product that goes to the client is right. So there's that aspect to it. Probably more on continuing competence. It is about regular check-ins. It's about constructive feedback. So I kind of would recommend the art of delivering constructive feedback, which helps people identify their learning and development needs, which can be sort of part of the program as well. Probably more broadly beyond supervision, it's probably about the culture as well within the organisation that creates a learning culture. So we at Trials have also set up in a larger firm, we have mentors which people can work with outside their immediate department. So we give those mentors sort of basic training and coaching type skills, but that's a neutral person beyond their day job who they can sort of bounce ideas off and can have a support throughout their career. So I think there's supervision, there's line managers, there's the overall culture within teams, and it's actually making learning and development as a key part of people's working day. And actually I think the difference perhaps between solicitors and barristers arguably can be is that people aren't working so independently. They should be working as a knowledge sharing outfit, so creating those opportunities for people to share knowledge through training or know-how sessions, or even just putting in people's diaries every so often, with a supervisor, let's have half an hour, ask a silly question, tell me what you need to know. And this can empower people to learn and take responsibility for their own learning to a degree in their careers, which I think is the right way to push it, by empowering people to take responsibility for their own learning while having a supportive learning environment within a firm.
I think there's an important thing to add as well, that good supervision is learnt. So I do think there's an argument to make sure that there is some training available to people to help them be good communicators and help them to give feedback in a way that means it's going to land well with the person that you're giving it to. I think we're in a world, aren't we, where we've got so many different ways to communicate with each other. I think we've now got Teams, work's now gone into WhatsApp groups and text messages as well, that used to really be personal channels of communication. So I think getting communication right goes hand in hand with good supervision. So support your people to do these things well. There's lots of great training out there. Obviously, I'm going to give that a plug because that's my business, but I do think it's important that people know how to do this properly.
Thanks, Claire. I wanted to pick up on a point you made at the start, Claire, about how a positive learning and development culture can support retention. But how about recruitment? Is this something that firms should be promoting if they have a positive approach to learning and development? Is it something that recruits are asking for or expecting?
Well, exactly. It definitely will. And I think you can evidence it with good data as well, that you capture data on how much time you spend in your organisation, investing in people, developing people, to attract people to your workplace. They'll be interested to know what your retention rate is and what the career path looks like, and how quickly does someone join and move from being newly qualified into senior associate, into partner, if that's, the titles of your structure. So capture all of that data, and I think good learning and development push all of those great processes within the business, and just the culture will be good and positive if those lines of communication are there. If you've got good managers, so you've got great management training, so there's a consistency in the way things are done, that's driven by learning and development. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think, all these interventions, the feedback, appraisals, good management, leads to people understanding what their learning and development needs are more, which feeds into this process. Because I think it is actually fairly difficult, I think, for people just to sit coldly and think, actually, what are my learning and development needs? So it needs the input of others as well to help people realise what those are, but actually make it absolutely clear that people need to be doing things to keep on top of their learning and development. But it's not always a course would be the big thing, I would say. I think automatically people are thinking, this person's got a learning and development need to send them on a course, when sometimes it's actually they need to sit down with this person with some knowledge, or they need to do some reading and research, and all that's all part of CPD. And I think the challenges with everybody, if you've got training as well, are sometimes restrictive budgets potentially. But I think the big point that I would say, there's so much knowledge within a law firm that actually sitting down one-to-one or in a collective group and just chatting through questions and issues is as effective as having a 1 hour formalised or 1.5 hour training session, which people, to be honest, may drift in and out of. So put the learner in control, get them to be asking the questions that they need to have answered, get the senior people feeding down, sharing their experience, and then it's win-win for everybody, I would say.
And that's the great thing about continuing competence, is it widens that net, doesn't it? You don't have to have an accredited piece of training with a number of units assigned to it. It's a lot more flexible, and it's, I think, a lot more modern in its approach. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I'd actually also say with the BD angle as well, writing for publication, so doing client-facing publication, getting people to research that area of law, learning how to write and communicate effectively. This is all full square within the competence requirements. So you can use CPD for business development as well, which is a pretty good way to think about it. Or indeed, you can have a training session which could turn into a client report, a client publication, which could turn into training for clients. So you could have one bit of learning which you sometimes use and alchemize, if that's a word, for all sorts of different purposes, which can help learning but also help develop business as well.
I just think on those 2 points, I think what it does show is that a lot of this will already be happening in your firm already. You'll be doing this on a day-to-day basis. But I think there is a disconnect between kind of what's happening there and what we see is that actually there's just that lack of evidence. So I think, it's a good discipline to try and get into. If you did have that 5-minute conversation with someone and you got some information that helped you, try and get your solicitors just to scribble that down somewhere. It doesn't, I was going to say go back on a cigarette packet, but probably don't have those anymore. But it can be anywhere. Just get into that habit, because I think that's what we're really looking for between kind of what we expect and what's happening in practice is that kind of demonstration of evidence.
I'd probably just say actually briefly as well that in terms of your own internal systems, if you've got big bucket categories of non-chargeable activities, you may want to think about breaking them down into more positive messages about delivering training and creating know-how. So actually, if those activities in terms of time recording aren't properly recognised, I'd say that's less of an incentive structurally to get involved in those things. So whatever system you have in place, regard those of sharing knowledge and training, writing for publication, BD as proper investment activities rather than these kind of non-chargeable things.
Okay, that's the end of our video from the actual conference that we held in Birmingham. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. We've got quite a few come in, but there's time for more, so don't be shy. But let's start off then by putting the questions that we've had in so far to Richard and Claire. Richard, I'm going to start with you, please. We've had a question about Silex practitioners who work at SRA regulated firms. What is the SRA's expectations in terms of Silex practitioners continuing competence?
Thanks, Julia. From an individual perspective, a Silex regulated individual will be subject to Silex's own continuing competence requirements, but we do have an obligation in our code of conduct for firms that requires firms to ensure that all their employees are competent. So our individual requirements won't apply to a Silex individual, but the firm just needs to make sure they've got something in place to make sure that the individual is competent.
Thanks, Richard. And there's a question about training records. You mentioned that we will be looking at calling in some training records over the next few weeks. How about into next year is the question. Will we continue to do so into next year?
Well, to call in training records for some solicitors who are providing immigration and asylum services, and letters have gone out. So, and our work to call in training records will continue next year. But that will be the areas we look at will be subject to our ongoing data analysis. So, what is our data telling us, and where do we need to look? Will drive particular practice areas and particular types of firms we might call in training records from.
Thanks, Richard. Claire, we've had a question from Sarah. She's asking whether we have any recommendations when the junior you are supervising doesn't produce much documentation as part of their role, but is instead meeting clients or is out of the office, for example, at court. Any suggestions there?
So I'm assuming that they're still going to have things like performance evaluation, and they'd still set some objectives around their role and responsibilities. And I think that's where their training needs come from. So that's their reflection piece. And from that, you can decide what those training needs are and address them, and then do them and evaluate them. So it doesn't have to be documentation that becomes your training record. It could be some diary entries that cite conversations that they've had around activities that they've done, how that's helped them with their personal development, extra things that they might need to continue to become competent, to continue to grow in their role and thrive. So I think the focus on documentation is the wrong one. It can be as simple as having a really good entry in your Outlook calendar that says, this is the activity I was involved in, this is what I learnt as a consequence of that, this is how it's going to help me moving forward, and build up that library of information, and that becomes your record then. Do you think that answered the question, Julia? Did I understand it correctly?
Yeah, I think it probably does. There's perhaps a related question from somebody who was asking how, as a sole practitioner, they can most effectively ensure that they are meeting their own continuing competence requirements. Maybe that links to your previous answer, Claire.
Yeah, I think the word reflection, it could apply to personal reflection, it could apply to reflecting with somebody else in a formal setting like an appraisal, or it could be, if I was a sole practitioner, I would be looking to another sole practitioner to support me and do some peer-to-peer mentoring with them, because we all have blind spots. We don't know what we don't know, and having another person who we can talk to and ask for feedback from is really positive. We could also get feedback. If I was a sole practitioner, I would be getting feedback from clients, and that becomes an area of focus that I would want to work on to personally develop. So I think explore those avenues. And again, any training and development that you do should really relate specifically to the needs I've identified that I need to address, where my potential, blind spots or gaps are in my competence. Those are the things that I'm going to focus on.
Thanks, Claire. Before I put this one to Richard, can I just ask for your views? This is a question that's come in as to whether it's helpful for a firm perhaps to have a minimum hours requirement. It's not something that we require as a regulator, but what do you think about that, Claire? Is it helpful for a firm to have perhaps a benchmark in terms of the number of hours of learning and development expected?
Yeah, my perspective on this is, when continuing competence first came out, I think it was 2015, I said to my business, let's not have a number of hours, let's leave that, let's embrace the spirit of continuing competence. But it was a really difficult thing, and continues to be a difficult thing for people to get their head around. And I think John mentioned it in the recording that we just saw, John Worrell. They've kept their 16 hours all within their business. They've kept that as a minimum. And in reality, if you are doing all of those steps of continuing competence, you're going to have more than 16 hours recorded. So just to have that minimum in for people as a focus, I think, is a positive thing. There's quite a few firms that I've worked with since who have kept a minimum requirement in there. And I think as one of the many checks and balances, I think it's good. I think if you've only got that as guidance for people, then that's problematic, because actually having that minimum needs to also be accompanied with some good processes around evaluating performance and having a learning culture and having good supervision. So as long as it's in there along with other positive things, I think it's fine, and I think it's a good thing to have.
Thanks, Claire. Richard, anything you wanted to add on that hours conundrum?
I agree with everything that Claire said. I suppose it's just to point out a danger, really, of just relying on hours-based approaches, that actually, there is a danger if you do that, then people are more focused on just accumulating the hours, as opposed to undertaking kind of any meaningful activity. So I think, whilst our position is that hours is absolutely fine, you do need to, I think, as Claire said, make sure that, whatever you're doing is driving the right type of learning behaviours that you want within your organisation.
Is it worth just reminding people of the problem that we used to have, or certainly I had in the business I worked in before 2015, that people would get to the end of the CPD year and there'd suddenly be a rush on training that people could get those hours up, and it often was not relevant to their role and not helpful. And that's the problem that continuing competence is looking to solve. It's treating people as professionals and saying, look, focus mostly on where you might have some gaps, where you might have some blind spots, and look to address those, because that's really where your focus needs to be. Julie, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. We had a question that came in while the video was running, and the question was answered to an extent during the videos, but there may be things that either Richard or Claire wish to add. So the question was about what kind of activities can contribute towards meeting continuing competence requirement. Is it only seminars, or is there a wider range of activities that can be covered? Claire?
Well, that's a really positive answer to that one, because yes, a lot more than seminars. And I mentioned in the call that 70-20-10 rule that we have. So actually only 10% of our learning happens in a formal setting. So any meetings that you have with a training element or a development element to them, as long as you can explain what that training and development was and how it addresses a need that you had, then yes, that's relevant, and make sure that there is a record of that. Similarly, if you do activities like coaching, mentoring, include those as well. If business development can be included as well. So discussions around clients and how you serve your clients to the best of your ability, and making sure that client service is excellent and driving that. Those things are included in continuing competence. So yeah, definitely it's much better to have that broad focus than just formal training. Because Richard said it as well in the call, there's so much that already happens that's possibly not being captured. So the issue might just be around just capture what you're doing in a way that you can evidence.
Thanks, Claire. Now, in the video, there was some discussion about how hybrid working has changed approaches to supervision. But Claire, I don't know if you have any experience of how hybrid working might have changed approaches to continuing competence, the type of activities that solicitors are undertaking, perhaps.
Yeah, so hybrid working impacted our ways of working considerably, didn't it? And I think it makes it even more important that a business has some systems and some checks and balances in place for people, so that everybody has a similar approach to continuing competence. I think one of the real positives that's come out of hybrid working is people have become more comfortable with tech and technology and systems. So integrating how you keep track of continuing competence within those systems and using tech is important. So, for example, where we had appraisals, there would be some questions in there about continuing competence. I wouldn't be over reliant on people's answers to those. You also want to go in and just check that people are giving real meaningful answers. But I think embracing technology and having checks and balances in your business, or a standard that everyone works to, is really good, because I think that's the worry that people have with hybrid working. Is everybody engaged? Is everybody doing things in a similar way? So just look to introduce that.
Thanks, Claire. Richard, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just building on, I suppose, kind of Claire's points, really. I suppose the danger of hybrid working is that you do lose those kind of touch points with other colleagues, or those kind of informal interactions where you might well have a conversation about a particular problem or issue that you're addressing. So I think it's really for firms to think about using kind of the virtual technology available to us, how they can try and replicate that. And we've got guidance on our website around effective supervision, and as part of that there is a section about that includes very helpful practical tips that firms might want to think about to achieve that, to achieve what I've just talked about in terms of replicating that kind of office environment. Some of them are really, really simple and really cost effective. So I think I'd just encourage firms to have a look at that if that's the sort of route they want to go down.
Thanks, Richard. And we've had a follow-up question to the question that you answered on Silex practitioners, and it concerned the competence of non-lawyer employees within a firm. Is there anything that you can add to your previous answer, Richard?
I don't think so, Julie. I think, you know, the rule in our code of conduct firms is really clear that, you know, it covers employees and managers. So yeah, I think that probably answers that question.
Thanks. Yeah, firms need to want to, I'm sure, ensure that all their employees are competent to fulfill their role. We've had no more questions, and we're anyway just about at time. So can I thank Claire and Richard very much for joining us today and answering the questions that have come in. Can I thank everybody who's joined us for the session and who's posed questions. I hope you found the session useful, but you will see that there's a link to provide your feedback. Is the format working for you? Anything that we can learn for future sessions? There are further sessions from the Virtual Compliance Officers Conference that are running this week. The next one, in fact, is at 12:30, and it's on cybercrime, understanding AI and protecting your firm. But all sessions, including this one, will be available to watch on our YouTube channel forevermore. So please, if you want to catch up on any of the sessions, take the opportunity to do so. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.